Today, we have the pleasure of having with us two gentlemen, Dennis Delpino and Joe Schlater. These gentlemen have done a tremendous amount of research into the Russian interference in our elections. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. It probably won't be much more than what you got on your program, but that's okay. So we're going to turn the program over to them now, and they're going to go do their presentation, and then we'll have time for questions and answers after they finish. Okay, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Estonia, a small European democracy along the Russian border, an American ally, and a country that hadn't seen political violence once in its modern history. Not until April 26, 2007.
We live quite near to the main event with my husband and my oldest child. When I went home, I saw some people there, and I was pretty scared. My husband was ready to protect our family then at the night.
And they're chanting Russia.
Yeah, they're shouting Russia, Russia, Russia.
Do you think that this was spontaneous, or do you think this was being encouraged?
No, this wasn't spontaneous, because a couple of days before, lots of people came from Russia to Estonia. But nobody knew it's going to be that massive. Nobody knew.
In 2007, Vladimir Putin's government interfered in Estonian politics, stoking unrest, mounting cyber attacks, trying to disrupt the government. Any of this sound familiar?
That was a short piece put out by the New York Times about the subject we're going to talk about today. It has to do with technology, and how technology is a threat to our democracy. Okay? First, I'd like to thank Kathleen for inviting us, and thank you all for coming. I noticed in the announcement your motto here. Remember, democracy is not a spectator sport. Actively support those who represent your ideals, or be content with someone else's choice. That's great. It's right on. How many of you remember the old Southern comedian, Brother Dave Gardner? Anybody? Okay. Brother Dave had a saying that was similar to that. Ask those that don't want any, have memories of not getting none. And that's also apropos. But, so today, our topic or theme is going to be how the latest technology is being used to wage war on democracies of the world. I'm going to try and provide a little general context, backgrounder, leading up to how we got to where we are, and then Joe's going to take it from there and talk about what's happening today. And it's really tough. We did this presentation on the 15th of September up in Northumberland County for Indivisible. And just in trying to prepare for this one, it's amazing how much change there's been. You're really running to keep up with things. And then finally, we'll just open it for Q&A and maybe have a few suggestions of what we can do and where we go from there. First off, there is an old saying, probably many of you heard of. Democracy has within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And I think this is applicable today, because democracy is the lever that is being used against us, our own democracy. Throughout history, we generally think about war as primarily a military action or a series of military actions. But if one looks closer, we can always see that there's been a non-military aspect to it. So you see, here's a picture of old Uncle Ho, Ho Chi Minh. And the North Vietnamese employed a technique they call Dao Tran. which means political struggle. In other words, there was a political dimension. Okay? And examples of that, back in the 50s, during the first Indochina War with France, he said the war for Indochina will not be won, was not won or lost in the battlefields of Indochina, it was won in Paris. Fast forward about a decade, and we're starting to get involved in Vietnam, and he says the war for Vietnam will not be won or lost in the battlefields of Vietnam, it will be won or lost in Washington, okay, through non-military means. All right. Next slide, Jim. Okay, some other things in history. Everybody remembers the ancient Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu? Okay. Basically, the best way to win a war is without firing a shot. And the bottom one there is particularly germane for today. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. Next. Okay. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, or SISI, which our senator from Virginia is the minority leader of, or the vice chairman in this case of the SISI, has put out 2 reports so far this year. And this is from Volume 2, Russia's Use of Social Media, that was put out just about 2 weeks ago, I think. The first one was put out in September. But it's talking about how Russians traditionally have used disinformation. One really good example of this, in the late 70s and early 80s, the Russians, mostly through the KGB, one of the things they used to do quite a bit of was they had a number of independent stringer journalists who were working in Africa. And what they would do is they would give these stringers stories that these African journalists would plant in African papers, hoping that they would be picked up by the international wire services like AP, UPI, Reuters, and Agence France Presse. Once they hit the international wire services, they were as good as gold. But they were doing this with the technology available at the time. Okay? Next slide. Now, things have changed, okay? Jimmy Durante used to have a favorite saying, everybody's trying to get into the act. And that's what's happening today, okay? We're seeing the North Koreans, we're seeing the Chinese, we're seeing the Russians doing all this. But this, there is a company in Egypt called New Waves. And it's a for-profit company, and they engage what they call internet warfare. Now, New Waves is made up by a bunch of retired Egyptian officers who run this company out of a house on an Egyptian military base that's for retired Egyptian military officers. And not coincidentally, their internet warfare campaigns tend to mirror the interests of countries like Egypt, the UAE, and the Saudis. So this is basically a mom and pop operation compared to what other countries are doing, but it just shows through technology, anybody can get into the act. So let's go back for a second to the video we showed. This was the video on Russian meddling in Estonia, was about 2007. The Russians and the Chinese and a number of other people who, let's just say, they're not enemies, they're competitors, all right? Looking for a way to be competitive with the United States. The Soviet Union is gone. We've been through Gorbachev. Boris Yeltsin is trying to forge a country together, but he's having problems, and Mr. Yeltsin had some personal problems that hampered his effectiveness too. And then Saddam invades Kuwait in '91. And what President Bush did was he mounted a very, very effective campaign. Actually, in Desert Storm, we paid for 10% of it. The other 90% were picked up by the Arab states, particularly the Saudis. But what he showed the world was a swift, very efficient execution of not only joint operation being all services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, plus combined operations with other countries. This really surprised two world capitals, Moscow and Beijing, okay? And they didn't think that we could do that. But what it did was it clearly defined the United States as the world's only superpower. Now keep in mind, China is a rising economic power at the time, and Russia is basically trying to get itself together, you know, out of the ashes of the Soviet Union. So, what they were doing then is they were trying different things. What you saw in the 2007 Estonia thing was one example of it. But they finally started to get their act together on how to compete with the United States when the new chief of the general staff of the Russian army, Valery Gerasimov, wrote an article, just a 2,000-word article in what was a trade magazine at the time, talking about using technology to undermine democracies. Now, that's a part of the article which is titled "The Value of Sciences is in the Foresight." But probably the best summation of what became known as the Gerasimov Doctrine was articulated in an article in Politico in their September-October 2017 edition. And I'll just read you one paragraph from it with regard to the Gerasimov Doctrine. This article, Gerasimov article, is considered by many to be the most useful articulation of Russia's modern strategy, a vision of total warfare that places politics and war within the same spectrum of activities, philosophically but also logistically. The approach is guerrilla, waged on all fronts with a range of actors and tools. For example, hackers, media, businessmen, leaks, and yes, fake news, as well as conventional and asymmetric military means. Thanks to the internet and social media, the kinds of operations Soviet PSYOPs teams once only could fantasize about, like the upending the domestic affairs of nations with information alone, are now plausible. The Gerasimov Doctrine builds a framework for these new tools and declares that non-military tactics are not auxiliary to the use of force, but the preferred way to win. That they are, in fact, the actual war. Chaos is the strategy that Kremlin pursues. Gerasimov specifies that the objective is to achieve an environment of permanent unrest and conflict within an enemy state. Okay, I'll just repeat that last line. The objective is to achieve an environment of permanent unrest and conflict within an enemy state. Okay, that sets the stage. It isn't a coincidence, I don't think. And there are many different ways you can explain this, but this is my way. Okay? Traditionally, in mischief making in the old Soviet days and everything, beginning with the Bolshevik Revolution all the way up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, this was primarily a KGB function. What we've seen now is largely coming out of the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence. All right? And it just so happens that Russian military intelligence comes under this guy named Valery Gerasimov. No coincidence. But let's talk just now, digress for a second, and talk about the nature of war, okay? And the nature of war as it happens with us. So in the 20th century, and I just take out the nuclear aspect, so we're talking about conventional warfare. We don't go to war unless there's a congressional declaration under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The last time we declared war was on December 8, 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There have been no congressional declarations of war since. We had the Korean War, which we entered as a police action with the UN. The Korean War has not ended. We've been living in an atmosphere of an armistice since the 50s. Okay? The Tonkin Gulf Resolution, 1964. Lyndon Johnson goes to Congress, and he asks Congress for a resolution to change our status in South Vietnam from basically an advisory mission to one of active combat engagement with Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, a resolution. Desert Storm, George Bush asked for a resolution. When we went into Iraq, congressional resolution. So we have resolutions. Historically, wars have been waged for gaining territory and then subjugating people in the territory and everything like that. But in the 21st century, thanks to technology, there are new ways to go about this. And one term that largely uses asymmetric warfare. Okay? Asymmetric warfare basically is if your opponent is very strong in one area, you don't attack him in that area, you look for his weak spots, and you attack them through their weak spots. And technology has provided, and the internet and social media has provided a wonderful tool to wage asymmetric warfare against us. And I would remind you again what I started out with, the old saying that democracy has within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And that's what they're playing right now. And it's not just Mr. Putin. Xi Jinping is doing it to some extent. The North Koreans are doing it, but and even the Iranians are doing it. So this is what we have to be careful. But I'm going to wind up my part with a little question, okay? If people are waging warfare against us, yet there is no congressional resolution and no congressional declaration of war, are we at war? If somebody is waging war against us by some means, asymmetrical through the internet or whatever, are we at war, even though Congress hasn't pronounced it as such? Okay. And with that, I'm going to leave my part off with another little video.
On October 7th, the Homeland Security and Office of Director of National Intelligence, their assessment was that the U.S. intelligence community is confident that the Russian government directed the recent compromise of emails from U.S. persons and institutions, including from U.S. political organizations. Goes on to say these thefts and disclosures are intended to interfere with the U.S. election process. Quote, such activity is not new to Moscow. Russians have used similar tactics and techniques across Europe and Eurasia. Quote, based on the scope and sensitivity of these efforts, that only Russia's senior-most officials could have authorized these activities. General Clapper, those are still operable and correct statements?
Yes, Chairman McCain, they are. As I indicated in my statement, we stand actually more resolutely on the strength of that statement that we made on the 7th of October.
I thank you. And so really what we're talking about is if they succeeded in changing the results of an election, which none of us believe they were, that would have to constitute an attack on the United States of America because of the effects if they had succeeded. Would you agree with that?
First, we cannot say they did not change any vote tallies or anything of that sort.
Yeah, I'm just talking.
We have no way of gauging the impact that certainly the intelligence community can't gauge the impact it had on choices the electorate made. There's no way for us to gauge that. Whether or not that constitutes an act of war, I think, is a very heavy policy call that I don't believe the intelligence community should make, but it's certainly would carry, in my view, great gravity.
Thank you. Admiral Rogers, have you seen this problem in your position getting worse or better? In other words, it's my information that their techniques have improved, their capabilities improved, the degree of success has improved. Is that your assessment?
So I have publicly said before that the Russians are a peer competitor in cyber. If you look broadly beyond the Russians to cyber writ large, the level of capability of nation states and actors around the world continues to increase. I can't think of a single significant actor out there who is either decreasing their level of investment, getting worse in their tradecraft or capability, or in any way backing away from significant investments in cyber.
I would not underestimate the weight that we as Americans assign to the Russian attempts to interfere with our internal political processes. Another aspect of Mr. Putin's conduct is the fact that he took his capabilities in the cyber area and used it to try to influence our election. There was a very serious effort made by Mr. Putin and his government and his organization to interfere in major ways with our basic fundamental democratic processes. In some quarters, that would be considered an act of war.
Let me begin where the appointment order begins, and that is interference in the 2016 presidential election. As alleged by the grand jury in an indictment, Russian intelligence officers who were part of the Russian military launched a concerted attack on our political system. The indictment alleges that they used sophisticated cyber techniques to hack into computers and networks used by the Clinton campaign. They stole private information and then released that information through fake online identities and through the organization WikiLeaks. The releases were designed and timed to interfere with our election and to damage a presidential candidate. And at the same time, as the grand jury alleged in a separate indictment, a private Russian entity engaged in a social media operation where Russian citizens posed as Americans in order to influence an election. These indictments contain allegations, and we are not commenting on the guilt or the innocence of any specific defendant. Every defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. The indictments allege, and the other activities in our report describe, efforts to interfere in our political system. They needed to be investigated and understood, and that is among the reasons why the Department of Justice established our office. And I will close by reiterating the central allegation of our indictments, that there were multiple, systematic efforts to interfere in our election. And that allegation deserves the attention of every American. Thank you. Thank you for being here today.
Joe.
Thank you. First, thanks to everybody for coming today. And I think Denny has done an excellent job of laying out where we are. The important thing is to understand that we're not going to be fighting a war with armored divisions going at one another on the plains of Europe again. Instead, the function of warfare really is to, if you can't destroy your enemy, you destroy his will to fight. And that's the purpose of information warfare, and that's what we're engaged in here. I want to start with what the U.S. intelligence community had to say. This is not classified in any way. The IC put out an unclassified version of their assessment of Russian interference in the election of 2016, and it demonstrates a significant escalation in the directness and the level of activity and the scope of effort compared to previous operations, because we have seen attempts to interfere in elections for at least 3 decades. We assessed that Mr. Putin ordered the campaign. The goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process. This right here is the most important part of that statement: undermine faith in the U.S. democratic process. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes here. We have high confidence in his judgments. The U.S. intelligence community is 17 different organizations. It's not just the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. Most of the executive departments have their own spooks. The Commerce Department is interested in in financial data, commerce and business data. The Treasury Department is interested in money moving around the world and that kind of thing. The State Department has their Bureau of Intelligence and Research that focuses on political goings-on around the world, both internal to other nations and external as they aim toward us and the rest of the world. And so when you get 17 different agencies together and they all agree on the same thing, it's most unusual. And to have them say we have high confidence in these judgments is even more unusual. We assess also that they will apply the lessons that they learned from 2016 into future elections in an attempt to further influence efforts worldwide against us. Who did it? We know where this came from. An operation of this magnitude has got to be approved at the highest levels. Any operations of this sort coming from us would have to be approved at the White House because of the danger to you if those things fail. Conducted by Russian military intelligence. Dennis has made this point that the military, Russian military, essentially has taken over what we think would be a political operation. And we know where it was done, out of a nondescript building in St. Petersburg, Russia, by the Internet Research Agency. In fact, they even advertised for help. In 2013, they were saying, we need some folks who are computer geeks, and if you'll come to work for us, we'll even give you a free power supply and help you learn some things. And 2016 was not new. We can track attacks on the elections in 27 different countries all the way back to 2004 and really beyond. What did they do? There were two axes of attack. First was direct attacks. There were direct attacks by hacking into state voting systems and into voting systems produced for use by states. And I'll show you that in a minute. And there also was a direct attack by hacking into the Democratic National Committee computer systems. And the second thing they did was an influence operation. You know, it's one thing to be able to attack somebody directly, drop bombs on them, shoot artillery on them. But if I can change your opinion, if I can change your view of the world, if I can change the way you make decisions, then I don't have to go to war to win. So what we saw was both direct attacks and an influence operation. And let's look at some of these. Speaking of the data that's used, the former campaign chairman, Mr. Manafort, provided polling data and a number of from 7 swing states to Konstantin Kilimnik, who is associated with the GRU. And Mr. Trump won by that many votes in 3 of these states where Mr. Manafort passed data on to Kilimnik. You see how important this becomes. Let's look at the direct attacks. Attacked electoral systems in all 50 states. There is no indication that vote totals were changed. And I don't think you're going to see any attempts to change vote totals because if you think about it, I'm on the electoral board up in Northumberland County. And the way we report votes is the minute the polls close, our precinct chief pulls a tally off the voting machine, gets on the phone, calls us in, we write it down, read it back to him, and then we go on the state website and enter those votes. And it takes a couple of minutes for it to process through, and then we look at the state website to make certain that that's the votes we did. We then meet on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday after the election to do our canvass and look at the provisional votes and make sure everybody got the paperwork straight. And we double check those votes and double check them with the state, and then we put up our abstract of votes, which is the official count. And if there is one vote off, we get a phone call from the state or we call them. So I don't think you're going to see anybody messing around with vote totals. But instead, what we did see was attempts to fool around with voter registration systems. Think about this for a minute. You've been voting at the same precinct for 20 years. You go up there and show your ID, and they look you up in the poll book and they say, I'm sorry, you ain't registered to vote here. What is that going to do to your confidence in the system? Well, we're going to let you cast this provisional ballot. Well, I don't know about that. And what we saw was these attacks in all 50 states, and the attempts were to get into their voter registration systems. And this was not an occasional drive-by hack. The computer security people in several states said it was like hand-to-hand combat. We were undergoing attacks into our systems day in and day out for months. And a few states, in fact, saw their systems penetrated. They were able to clean things up. But here's something that really happened. You go in to vote, and you show your ID, and they look you up on the poll book, and up comes your name, and you get your ballot and you go vote. That's electronic poll book software. There are a few companies in the country that make this stuff, and it is certified federally by feds and by the various states. And then your local registrar can buy that software and put it on their laptops and use it to run their poll books. A manufacturer of electronic poll book software in Florida was hacked. And it appears as though the hackers, who were tracked back to the Internet Research Agency, dropped virus bombs into their computers so that as they prepared software to send out to counties, some of that software contained viruses that when in the Raleigh-Durham area in North Carolina and in 6 counties in Florida opened up their electronic poll books on election day, there was nothing there. And all of a sudden, the registrars had to scramble around, print paper poll books, hundreds of people waiting in line. It was not a happy day. It disrupted the process, and it caused folks to doubt the results. We had in Northumberland County some glitches with our electronic poll book software. Our vendor has told us time and again, no, we weren't hacked, but we're beginning to wonder. In fact, we have gone to a completely different system. A hack into the Democratic Party computer system stole emails and campaign documents, and then, of course, released votes. So you saw these direct attacks. But the influence operations are the really great part about this. Detailed data about every one of us is available. If you are online, somebody else knows what you're doing. Amazon has a list of everything you've ever purchased and looked at. I'm the captain of one of the rescue squads up in Northumberland County, and we needed a battery for one of our life packs. And so I had to get on the internet and search where I could get those batteries. And within 2 minutes, every time I went to a website, an ad popped up for a battery. This is the way internet commerce works. Amazon knows every book you've ever purchased. Were those books that tend to favor Democrats or Republicans? Are they conservative themed or very progressive or liberal themes? And that kind of stuff can be analyzed. Every Facebook page you visit, every website you visit. Do you go over here and read Fox all day long, or do you go over here and read MSNBC and get all excited when Rachel comes on? Somebody knows that. So there's a lot of data about us that's available. But data doesn't do any good unless you can put it to use. Artificial intelligence, which essentially is using a computer to mimic the human mind, has reached the point now where we can take volumes and volumes and volumes of data and use that data to analyze how it looks like you and you and you and you would react to a message. And that analysis then allows us to micro-target, to target you, not just to put out, as Dennis described, an article in a newspaper that is going to be circulated around a city in Africa, but to fire off an article that's going to pop up on your Facebook page or possibly in your email or on your Twitter account or in somebody that you follow that is going to begin to influence the way that you think and that you vote. And so I look at the I'm an old guy, I still think about the Irish Republican argument. But the Internet Research Agency, they focused really on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, mainly on Facebook and Twitter. And let me show you an example of what they did. Here's a guy right here, Melvin from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Melvin is a very friendly-looking guy. He's got a Facebook page. In fact, that's Melvin's Facebook page. And there's Melvin's daughter, and here's Melvin and his daughter and all. We're talking here about U.S. war crimes in Syria. And let me see, he's talking about 2.5 months into his presidency, Donald Trump has already set the world on fire or something like that. There's a little problem here. If you look where Melvin went to college, went to high school and college here, the problem is this: there's no such person as Melvin Reddick. He doesn't exist. The two schools have no record of him. The photos were snatched off a web page from somebody down in Brazil. His Facebook postings were all political. They were all anti-Hillary Clinton, and they all echoed commentary coming from Russian news outlets. He friended hundreds of voters in swing states: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida. He didn't go friending voters in Texas, which was a red state, Mississippi and Alabama, which are red states, New Hampshire and Virginia and Massachusetts, which are blue states. All his friends were aimed in swing states. And this is some of the stuff that you would see on Melvin's website. You really need to go look at the DC Leaks website. Man, that's a good place. They got some good stuff for you. So, some of the people that Melvin is friended are going to go to DC Leaks. Well, what is DC Leaks? DC Leaks is established in the middle of the election campaign. It was operated by Fancy Bear, which was one of the Russian hacking operations. Fancy Bear ran it. They published leaked documents coming out of the Democratic National Committee and off Ms. Clinton's email server and off the emails and documents from other candidates.
Hang on. Hillary's server was never hacked.
Well, hang on to that oh yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, for the comment period. The site shut down in March 2017. But Mr. Reddick is directing people to come down here and read this stuff, which is damaging to the Democratic candidate. This is some of the stuff we saw posted. Hillary is a co-author of Obama's anti-police and anti-constitutional propaganda. This is the kind of thing that was passed from some of these websites. This is very powerful right here. You'll all recall the Benghazi affair where one of the hearings got to the point of, well, why was our embassy attacked? Was it because of this? Because our consulate was attacked because of this, and the other. And Ms. Clinton said, well, what difference does it make at this point? That was a year ago. What difference does it make? It makes a difference to this lady whose loved one has come home and tested. And you see the commentary down here. Hillary will never understand. This is some powerful stuff. And it went out from a website, or rather from a Facebook account for the American Veterans, which was in fact tracked back to the Internet Research Agency. Well, if it's not about changing the votes in elections, what it's about? The Russians understand, Mr. Putin understands, that they cannot compete with us economically. They cannot go toe-to-toe with us militarily. And so the only hope is to weaken us internally and to degrade us internally, which is a pretty good way to go about it. And the goals within the United States are these: to create and expand distrust. It is no secret that our society is splintered, and we are splintered more than we've ever been at any time that I can recall. And I think most folks agree we have never been this splintered except 150 years ago during the Civil War. And so we can build on that that splintering in our society to pit us against each other and cause us to focus internally and not pay attention to what's going on externally. And I don't have it all up here, but international goals are this. The Russians look upon at least the eastern part of Europe the same way we look upon Central and South America. It's our backyard and our playground, and don't you come messing around in here. And so one of Mr. Putin's goals is to weaken our alliances and our relationships with the countries of Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and to sow discord and disrupt relationships within our treaty organizations, such as NATO. Well, what can we do about it? If I had the answer to that, I would have my own cable news show, and you'd be watching me instead of Rachel or Sean Hannity. We can, however, ourselves spread some facts. We can be cautious when we hear what sounds a little suspicious, and we can investigate. Just because it's on the front page of the paper or it's all over the news or whatever, does not mean it's true. You need to dig a little below the surface. I think that what we call the mainstream media deserves our support because there is still in this country a very, very strong media presence that adheres to professional journalistic standards, that actually goes and checks it out and digs. And I know there are a lot of folks running for office who probably wish they wouldn't do that, but these folks deserve our support. We should subscribe to our local newspapers. Local newspapers are dying. We need to subscribe to our local newspapers, our regional and some of our national papers. We need to support, I think, the major news media. There are a lot of places you can go to check facts. These are some websites that do a very good job of fact checking. And you can watch for giveaway phrases. And, you know, send this out to everybody that you know. Put this out to everyone on your email list. But beyond that, in confronting false information, what you've got to do is lead with your values. Everybody who has ever examined why people vote the way they do will tell you that policies and program proposals don't win votes. What wins votes is an appeal to people's values. Now, I was a college student in Alabama in 1960 when George Wallace was governor. I'm an old Southern white boy born in Mississippi in 1944. When I was growing up in Mississippi, the social mores were such that you did not ever call a black person Mr., Miss, or Mrs. As a 6-year-old kid, the old black guy that tended my grandmother's roses was John. I was 12 years old before I knew his last name was Gilmore. And the reason for that is we did not want to show these former slaves and descendants of slaves who are nowhere near our social level, we did not want to show them any respect. George Wallace got his start as a circuit court judge in South Alabama. There was one black lawyer in South Alabama out of Montgomery who practiced in Wallace's court. And when Wallace announced that he was going to run for the state legislature, this guy came up and announced he was going to support him. And all his friends said, why? And he said, because when I go into Mr. Wallace's courtroom, Judge Wallace's courtroom, he calls me Mr. All the other judges call me John. In 1958, George Wallace ran for the Democratic nomination for governor. His opponent was John Patterson. Now, in 1958, Democrats owned the South, and so the winner of the Democratic primary was the next governor. And George Wallace did what he had been doing all his career. He went down and he talked to all us rednecks in Alabama, and he talked to us about schools and roads, schools and roads. And he lost. John Patterson beat George Wallace like a red-headed stepchild. Beat him like he had never been beaten before. And after the election, and after his very embarrassing defeat, Wallace and his campaign manager sat down and said, why did this happen? George said, I know why it happened. Because I got up in front of the audience and I talked about roads and schools, and they sat on their hands. John Patterson got up and shouted, segregation, 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 and they stomped on the floor. That's what happens when I mean you appeal to people's values. Mr. Patterson appealed to the darkest side of us Southerners, and he won. And Mr. Wallace learned a lesson from that. Of course, if you go down Alabama right now, in every crossroads, there's a George Wallace Community Technical College, which he snuck in the back door and set up this very fine system of community technical colleges, and he finally won all those schools anyway. But you got to lead with your values. We all have some values. If you're at a loss to determine what values you own and what values we ought to be focusing on, you take the preamble to the Constitution. Form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. That's a pretty good set of values. I'm a Democrat, so I kind of lean toward Democrats. George McGovern, who was a B-17 bomber in World War II, published a little book, My Values. Jimmy Carter, best ex-president we ever had. Jimmy has a good book, Our Endangered Values, and when you read these books, and Theodore Sorensen, who was a biographer of Kennedy's, published a book back in the 1970s, Why I'm a Democrat. And when you read it, it sounds like it's coming from yesterday's headlines. But also when you read these, you understand. And I look at a lot of the websites and Facebook pages for some of the other side, for my Tea Party friends and for my Republican friends, and I read their values and their statements of values. And if you look at the values that these Democrats are putting out, and you look at the values that the Tea Party and the Republicans are putting out, there ain't a dime's worth of difference between them. We're all Americans. So you've got to lead with your values, and you've got to state that on your Facebook, your Instagram, your Twitter accounts. You've got to write letters to the editor. But you start your letters with, or you end your letters with, what are our values? And letters to the editor are important because newspaper folks will tell you that the letters page is the most frequently read page in the newspapers. Up in Northumberland County, we formed a group that got together every couple of months and said, okay, what are we going to write letters about over the next couple of months? And before long, we had taken over the letters pages on the local newspapers. We backed off a little bit, but I think we're getting ready to crank up here. Write letters. Read books. Share what you read. I've got down here somewhere a listing of books that I have read that I have found very important. And read them, share what you read, and a lot of times if I find something that I think is valuable, I'll buy an extra copy and put it in the library. Speak out in public. Don't be afraid to stand up and speak. But when you do, be sure that you're speaking from the basis of fact, that you're speaking reasonably, so you don't even get in people's faces. That doesn't do it. And lead with your values. And that pretty much wraps up that. Dennis has one more little video to show us, and then we'll open the floor.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Nunes and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. I have a short opening statement. I appreciate the importance of Congress's impeachment inquiry, and I'm appearing today as a fact witness, as I did during my deposition on October 14th, in order to answer your questions about what I saw, what I did, what I knew, and what I know with regard to the subjects of your inquiry. I believe that those who have information that the Congress deems relevant have a legal and a moral obligation to provide it. I take great pride in the fact that I'm a non-partisan foreign policy expert who has served under 3 Republican and Democratic presidents. I have no interest in advancing the outcome of your inquiry in any particular direction except toward the truth. I will not provide a long narrative statement because I believe that the interest of Congress and the American people is best served by allowing you to ask me your questions. And I'm happy to expand upon my October 14th deposition testimony in response to your questions today. But before I do so, I'd like to communicate two things. First, I'd like to share a little bit about who I am. I'm an American by choice, having become a citizen in 2002. I was born in the northeast of England, in the same region that George Washington's ancestors came from. Both my region and my family have deep ties to the United States. My paternal grandfather fought through World War I in the Royal Field Artillery, surviving being shot, shelled and gassed before American troops intervened to end the war in 1918. During the Second World War, other members of my family fought to defend the free world from fascism alongside American soldiers, sailors and airmen. The men in my father's family were coal miners, whose families always struggled with poverty. When my father, Alfred, was 14, he joined his father, brother, uncles and cousins in the coal mines to help put food on the table. When the last of the local mines closed in the 1960s, my father wanted to emigrate to the United States, to work in the coal mines in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. But his mother, my grandmother, had been crippled from hard labor, and my father couldn't leave. So he stayed in Northern England until he died in 2012. My mother still lives in my hometown today. While his dream of emigrating to America was thwarted, my father loved America, its culture, its history, and its role as a beacon of hope for the world. He always wanted someone in the family to make it to the United States. I began my university studies in 1984, and I just learned that I went to the same university as my colleague here, Mr. Holmes, in St Andrews in Scotland. I just thought I would add that. And in 1987, I won a place on an academic exchange to the Soviet Union. I was there for the signing of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty, and when President Ronald Reagan met Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in Moscow. This was a turning point for me. An American professor who I met there told me about graduate student scholarships to the United States. And the very next year, thanks to his advice, I arrived in America to start my advanced studies at Harvard. Years later, I can say with confidence that this country has offered me opportunities I never would have had in England. I grew up poor, with a very distinctive working-class accent. In England, in the 1980s and 1990s, this would have impeded my professional advancement. This background has never set me back in America. For the best part of 3 decades, I've built a career as a non-partisan, non-political national security professional, focusing on Europe and Eurasia, and especially the former Soviet Union. I've served our country under 3 presidents, in my most recent capacity under President Trump, as well as in my former position under my former position of National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. In that role, I was the intelligence community's senior expert on Russia and the former Soviet republics, including Ukraine. It was because of my background and experience that I was asked to join the National Security Council in 2017. At the NSC, Russia was part of my portfolio, but I was also responsible for coordinating US policy for all of Western Europe, all of Eastern Europe, including Ukraine and Turkey, along with NATO and the European Union. I was hired initially by General Michael Flynn, Katie McFarland, and General Keith Kellogg. But then I started work in April 2017 when General McMaster was the National Security Advisor. I, and they, thought that I could help them with President Trump's stated goal of improving relations with Russia, while still implementing policies designed to deter Russian conduct that threatens the United States, including the unprecedented and successful Russian operation to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. This relates to the second thing I want to communicate. Based on questions and statements I've heard, some of you on this committee appear to believe that Russia and its security services did not conduct a campaign against our country, and that perhaps, somehow, for some reason, Ukraine did. This is a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves. The unfortunate truth is that Russia was the foreign power that systematically attacked our democratic institutions in 2016. This is the public conclusion of our intelligence agencies, confirmed in bipartisan congressional reports. It is beyond dispute, even if some of the underlying details must remain classified. The impact of the successful 2016 Russian campaign remains evident today. Our nation is being torn apart. Truth is questioned. Our highly professional and expert career foreign service is being undermined. US support for Ukraine, which continues to face armed Russian aggression, has been politicized. The Russian government's goal is to weaken our country, to diminish America's global role, and to neutralize a perceived US threat to Russian interests. President Putin and the Russian security services aim to counter US foreign policy objectives in Europe, including in Ukraine, where Moscow wishes to reassert political and economic dominance. I say this not as an alarmist, but as a realist. I do not think long-term conflict with Russia is either desirable or inevitable. I continue to believe that we need to seek ways of stabilizing our relationship with Moscow, even as we counter their efforts to harm us. Right now, Russia's security services and their proxies have geared up to repeat their interference in the 2020 election. We are running out of time to stop them. In the course of this investigation, I would ask that you please not promote politically driven falsehoods that so clearly advance Russian interests. As Republicans and Democrats have agreed for decades, Ukraine is a valued partner of the United States, and it plays an important role in our national security. And as I told the committee last month, I refuse to be part of an effort to legitimize an alternate narrative that the Ukrainian government is a US adversary and that Ukraine, not Russia, attacked us in 2016. These fictions are harmful even if they're deployed for purely domestic political purposes. President Putin and the Russian security services operate like a super PAC. They deploy millions of dollars to weaponize our own political opposition research and false narratives. When we are consumed by partisan rancor, we cannot combat these external forces as they seek to divide us against each other, degrade our institutions, and destroy the faith of the American people in our democracy. I respect the work that this Congress does in carrying out its constitutional responsibilities, including this inquiry, and I'm here to help you to the best of my ability. If the President or anyone else impedes or subverts the national security of the United States in order to further domestic political or personal interests, that's more than worthy of your attention. But we must not let domestic politics stop us from defending ourselves against the foreign powers who truly wish us harm. I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Before we open up the floor for questions, there are some discs back there. Feel free to take one if you like. They include some of the videos you've seen and some videos we haven't shown you. But there's still some there left, and if you want them, there they are. Okay? So, questions?
I have put out, I think they're all gone, copies of the little book on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century. If you have not read this, they're about $3 a piece at Amazon. This is probably one of the most important things published in the last several years. And it's easy to read, but it takes a lot of study. I put together a little bibliography of my own. It's kind of a left-leaning bibliography, but please don't be afraid of it. Some of the things that I have read and found useful. Okay.
Questions?
Can I just have a word?
Sure.
I have read this book, and I have a fair amount of dyslexia, and it's a beautiful, easy book to read. And if I could sound a little more like Fiona Hill, I'd be very pleased.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
You listed as the goals of Russia to worsen relationships between countries in Europe and also here between groups here. Mm-hmm. And they recognize they can't beat us in a hot war, but are they trying to foment hot wars between other countries or a civil war here?
You know, it's interesting because in the time between when we did this presentation on the 15th of September and now, you're seeing Mr. Putin, and this is all about Mr. Putin, okay? You're seeing him do a little shift, and you're seeing now he's running around the world. He cemented in a few weeks ago a nuclear cooperation treaty with a bunch of African nations. Okay, he's stopped into Saudi Arabia 4 times, seeing what is it, the Grand Crown Prince. He's been with the head of the UAE and things. I guess right now he's judging that we are weakened enough and divided enough, and let's face it, our foreign policy is being disassembled. It's being disassembled. Our influence around the world is being questioned. And maybe what you're seeing is Putin is being a little more open, a little more overt now. In basically, he sees a power vacuum that's created that we're leaving, and he's snapping it up. So it's already having an effect on us and our foreign policy and things like that. Yes, ma'am.
My amazement at having grown up, you know, in the Cold War and the, you know, Cuban Missile Crisis. My dad was at the Naval Weapons Station, you know, loading ships. I mean, it's still clear in my mind when we did the, you know, nuclear attack drills in our schools. I just find it amazing that so much of our society today is immune to what, you know, Putin is capable of. How, you know, they can go along with the idea that, well, if he told Trump that they weren't involved, then we're gonna believe him. I mean, I know some of it is lack of history and that kind of thing, but it's gotta be more going on.
Oh, well, one of the, and I won't just say Mr. Putin, but anybody who wishes us ill, the best way to get at us is to sow distrust within the American population. And you can look at the way campaigns were conducted, presidential campaigns, okay? I personally noticed in 1980, presidential campaigns took a turn for the nasty, okay? And they've been that way ever since. And instead of saying what you're gonna do for the country, it's cutting down the other guy, cutting down the other side. And it's, like Joe said, attacking through values, okay? So if you can erode the trust to such a point, then everything's fake news, right?
So
one thing to point out here is the Internet Research Agency exploited divisions in the United States. They did not create those divisions. My great-great-granddaddy and his brothers and cousins owned 270 slaves. And that has created a division that is still with us today. I forget what the percentage was, but it was a very large percentage, approaching 50% of the Internet Research Agency's effort was directed at suppressing the black vote by saying Hillary doesn't care anything about you, don't go out and vote, your vote's not going to make any difference. You saw, I guess I didn't have it up there, but there was a thing that the Internet Research Agency passed that was got over 26 million views, and it was a picture of famous gun grabbers in history: Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and Hillary. And you know, they didn't create the divisions in our society. Those divisions are already there. They simply played on those divisions, which is why I think it's important that we start talking to each other and not talking past each other.
You way back there, and then you and Militia.
I think that a lot of these same tactics are happening right in our own political systems, and that's why the young people don't look at anything anymore. They distrust the political systems. The parties are, since the 80s, have been working against one another. Citizens United has created a money power system, and we don't need the Russians to hurt us. We've got enough problems on our own.
Right. Well, you know, one thing you noticed also since the 80s, okay?
How did the 1980 election, how did that create the dissension?
No, beginning. Okay, normally the pattern is
Reagan and Carter.
Normally the pattern is you use politics as the means to achieve office. Once you achieve office, you start to govern. In 1980, beginning with the 1980 election, every president since has been campaigning 365 days a year. Now, what we're seeing right now is a campaign. It's a campaign every day, and minimal governing. Okay, you campaign to get elected to govern.
Well, who governs other than the politician? The bureaucracy?
The bureaucracy assists the politicians who are elected.
Well, if the politicians aren't governing, then is the bureaucracy governing?
We prefer to call career civil servants.
Huh? You're saying the politicians are not governing?
The guy,
Is
no,
the
the guy
bureaucracy
who
governing?
calls the shots is the President of the United States. And your elected representatives to Congress, they call the shots constitutionally, okay?
Okay.
If they don't call the shots, the bureaucracy doesn't function, okay? So it's the people we elect who are playing politics 365 days a year and not governing.
Are you
My
saying
opinion.
that before 1980, that the
I'm not talking in absolutes. What I'm saying is, in 1980, you notice a big shift. For the first time, what you saw were politicians who were campaigning 360 days a year after they were elected.
And so what difference does that make?
Look around you today. Look around you today. You see the difference. And what we've been talking about is a foreign policy that's collapsing. We have a foreign policy that's collapsing.
What
I
you're
respect
saying is
it.
nobody's governing and that's why it's such a mess?
Term limits at home.
Yeah, in a way, you're right. You're right.
Could I just piggyback on that? That
Sure.
the idea is that they're doing what's best for them to be reelected, not what's best for the governing of the
That's
country.
always been.
No, it hasn't.
It's worse now
No,
than
it
it's ever
hasn't.
been.
Trust me. It hasn't. Well, you don't have to trust me. But I've had experience with two
I
presidents.
can tell you one thing, when a politician is elected, his primary aim is to get reelected.
Well, then we as a general public need to go out and find politicians who are ready to govern.
Lady in the yellow shirt.
Lady in the yellow shirt, yeah.
So there is a new player in this, the Epic Times. And you guys,
Oh, the Epic Times.
I pulled a cousin out of it recently, but a couple of the guys on Facebook have fallen in.
Yeah, the Epic Times.
Do you guys have a presentation on that?
No, we don't. But I've read the Epic Times a number of times. It's basically put out by the anti-Chinese lobby.
I know, it's a full-on publication, but
Yeah.
you guys have a gravitas, and I'd love to put you in front of some of my neighbors.
No. Yes.
Can I just observe that in 1980, Reagan he was the president.
We're not
He was
naming
an
names.
actor. He was an actor.
Yep.
And it's like the media's taken over. I'm sick of getting, surveys, and then they
Yeah.
end up with a donation request.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I expect my leader to have some really good ideas.
Leadership.
And I think,
Yeah.
I can go on board with
Yeah.
that. I don't expect them to be playing the odds and trying to find out
Right.
how to appeal or whatever.
Right.
And,
Not looking towards the next campaign, but actually governing.
Very disappointing from then on.
Yeah.
And I actually think that Carter was one of the best presidents. And unfortunately, there were the Iranian hostages that became a pawn
Yeah.
in that election. So.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to bring up something. Some of the rest of you may have seen Leslie Stahl talking to Walter Isaacson the other night. And she was, she wasn't saying this directly, but you could make this connection. That, of course, we need to support the mainstream media, but the edges, and there's a list that's gone around in this group of mainstream media you can, quote, trust. It's really reporting facts, but the edges are so blurred. And Leslie Stahl made the point that if you, as a newscaster, show your biases, you are muddying the waters. And I'd just like to hear what other people think about that, because what I'm thinking is perhaps
Well, I
we
agree.
need to support those who really do not do that.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Because
media
it
definitely plays a
undermines
role in this.
trust.
They definitely do.
Well, I'm responsible. I think that they should preface their bias if they're going to do that.
Exactly.
You know, if they want to be commentators or something like that, then they should preface that they are, rather than say, trying to act like that they're unbiased.
Well, yes.
Well, then they're not supposed to be given opinions. If you want to be a journalist, you're not supposed to be given opinions. You're just supposed to report the facts.
But when a conglomerate buys up a bunch
Well,
of
that's-
news stations and newspapers throughout the country and say, on this date, this is what I want you to say.
Right.
And if they don't say it, they either quit their jobs or they say what they're told.
Well, there's several things that have happened at the federal level that have an impact on this. Number one was the end of the Federal Communications Commission's fairness doctrine. And I forget the date that it was, but essentially the fairness doctrine dropped out. The fairness doctrine basically said, and there were variations on the way it was interpreted and used, was that if you provide some time to this point of view on a public media outlet, you have to provide some time to that point of view on a public media outlet, and we no longer do that. A second thing that is very important, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is the Citizens United decision. The case citation, the Citizens United v. the Federal Election Commission. And the case came because of congressional legislation that limited the amount of money that could be donated to candidates and to candidate committees. And the organization Citizens United argued that a donation to a candidate is a form of free speech. And if you limit the amount of money I can give to a candidate, you are limiting my speech. And in a 5-4 decision, the court said, you're right. Therefore, there can be unlimited donations, and certain groups do not have to disclose where the money is coming from. The definitive work on that was done by a New York Times reporter, I forget her name, but it's called Dark Money. And she tracks back what seems to be independent political action committee that actually is being funded back up here by a very giant political action committee. And until we can get money out of politics, and until we can get back to some kind of, but you know, we all have, we Americans have this laissez-faire attitude. We don't like regulation. We don't like anybody telling anybody else what to do. So I don't know that we're ever going to go back to the days of a fairness doctrine and limits on campaign donations.
Kathleen, you ought to have it for
What should they?
Yeah, that's good.
Well, we'll
Pick
work
a
on
date.
that too.
Just wait back.
On the back row, yes, ma'am.
Yes, you.
So I guess going back to the issue of whether or not the media is biased or members of the media are biased or not, I think we are in a place where there's a serious conundrum, because at the beginning of the Trump administration, mainstream media outlets were criticized for attempting to report on what was going on in some neutral fashion. And it took a long time for people to get to the point where they could legitimately say, this is a lie. These people are lying. We can prove without a shadow of a doubt that this is simply not true. And it took us a long time to get to that. And I think that we were poisoned. I mean, the airwaves were poisoned, the media was poisoned, social media was poisoned by all of the untruths that were put out there, seeded by whoever. And now it's just really impossible for people to sort through that. But I appreciate seeing media who don't attempt. I mean, I don't like Rachel. She makes me crazy. But I do like Nicole Wallace. Nicole Wallace was a Republican, and she had, she's somebody she's very straightforward, but she's like going crazy over all this. Anyway, I just think that the ability for us to be able to pay attention to folks who are working very hard to sift through and find out what's really true is difficult given the amount of misinformation that's out there.
Or not only are we being polarized politically, but need to remember, big media is big business. And there is, it's not a bias per se, but it's a kind of a glorification of their trade. Let me tell you a brief story, true story, okay? You all remember during the Reagan administration, the Grenada campaign? Okay? And there was a clip of film, okay? And Dan Rather showed it. And before he showed it, he said 3 times, he said, now we have to warn you, this has been edited by the Defense Department. Did I tell you it was edited by the Defense Department? Okay. I had the raw uncut film in my office. I saw the whole raw uncut film. And here's what was edited by the Defense Department. It was a film of 2 guys in the back, 2 Army guys in the back of a truck, a camera crew, were going down a road. And they were filming as the truck was going. And the truck hit a bump. And the camera went up, and you heard one of the cameramen say, "Oh shit." That's what was edited out. So, how about that, Dave? Yeah. Yes, sir.
How much of Trump's election would you say was due to Russia gaining access to the U.S. suite of hacking tools?
Oh. Yeah, you talked about that. Go ahead. I think you're referring to a specific hacking tool.
A lot smarter and more capable people than I have tried to answer that question. And the answer is, we just don't know what the full impact was. Whether it was 70,000 votes, whether it was thousands of votes, hundreds of votes. The best thing I have read on that, this lady, Kathleen Jamison, is the director of the Annenberg Center of Public Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. And her book is entitled Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect the President. What we don't know, what we can't know, and what we do know. And she arrives at the conclusion, what this lady does is, there are several different academic models that look at data that say, this is what causes people to vote this way when they go and vote. And she took data from the 2016 election and applied all these different academic models to it. And at the end, she says there was some influence, but we can't tell you how much it was.
Yeah, because I've heard that Russia essentially has access to the hacking software, all the hacking tools that the NSA has.
Yeah.
That and that they would possibly be using that in the election.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, and I think what you heard is an exaggeration. From what I understand, what happened was NSA had a particular hacking program. Now, you all remember Edward Snowden? Okay? Edward Snowden was part of the group that released that hacking program. And once it was out, people used it. Not only the Russians, but other people have used it against us. And I think that's specifically what you're referring to.
Okay. And what program was that?
Oh, the name is in the public domain now.
Okay. And what was its function out there?
Change things as far as I go. Yeah, I don't know that much about it, but I know that sequence happened.
Yes, sir.
I have 2 thoughts to offer. We hear a lot about thinking in our silos or in our bubble. There's a cure for that, but it takes energy. Read the other side. Listen to the other side. See if there's any evidence supporting what you believe or what someone else might believe. And that's a way to talk to other people and eliminate some of the warfare that's going on.
Yeah.
So that's one. The other is I have a deep objection to the term deep state, the way it's used. There was some discussion about what runs the government. There are thousands and thousands of people that run the government. They follow laws, they follow policies, they come up with procedures that implement laws and policies. It's a vast operation, to run even the state government. And when we say deep state, there are people who know how to implement the laws and how to follow policies. And when people are elected and want to change the policies or introduce different laws, then that's what these employees do. The deep state is actually the institutional memory of what we want done when we elect people. It's not a bad thing. And I was a state employee and in another state. And at the time, it was popular to say, oh, state employees, they don't work, we pay their salaries, they don't work. I never thought that. The people who worked for me worked very hard. And it wasn't strictly 40 hours a week. They worked hard. And if they didn't, they'd go somewhere else where they could make a contribution. So next time you hear somebody say deep state, think about all those people who spend a career implementing the laws that have passed and the policies of the people you elected.
Thank you. Thank you. Well,
By the way,
sounds like you're subscribing to smaller government.
I didn't say that.
Don't you think that would solve a lot of problems if we had less government?
We get the government we deserve.
Okay. So is that right? We get the government we deserve.
Thank you. When I came here today, not knowing exactly what to expect, I thought maybe I'd have to do a little countering here, but I'm very happy to say that Dennis and Joe did an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And I've got a little experience in the field, and everything they said is exactly right on, there's no doubt about it. But piggybacking on what he said, ask questions. I want to address what I see as the elephant in the room that no one has addressed. Everything they said is correct. Russia can be very stinky at times. I come from a little background that I'm an old Marine, and I retired as a lieutenant colonel in the Army Guard. But I served for 25 years as a liaison to the Russian government under Sergei Shoigu, who's now the defense minister, and Yuri Grashnikov in their Ministry of Emergencies. Very similar to that feeling here. And yes, Russia tries to do everything they can to be the biggest, the toughest country they can. But conversely, have we as the United States and all of our intelligence organizations, and I work with several, have we not been meddling in all the elections in Russia, Ukraine, Eastern European countries for an equally long time? We have been trying to subvert the Ukraine for decades to get them to join NATO, so they would have to kick out Russia's naval base in Crimea. That base has been there since about 1830, that biggest Blackwater base. And the Crimea is made up of 98% ethnic Russians who were being persecuted by the Ukrainians. And a lot of times we look at the Ukrainians as the underdog being picked on by Russia, but for those who know a little history, the Ukraine in World War II were pretty well siding with the Nazis. They were fighting us on one end and the Soviet Union on the other. They were a pretty vicious bunch of people. Ever since those days, they have been persecuting the Russians that live in the Ukraine. And one thing that Putin is, he's not light-fingered, he's very heavy-handed. And he doesn't go in and write letters of consternation when he feels his people were being persecuted. He went in with the tanks into the Ukraine and says, leave our people alone. Whether that was the right decision or not, I don't get involved in that. But the fact is, nobody has squeaky clean hands and things like this. Foreign policy does stink. And we have been meddling in their elections all over Eastern European countries, putting missiles all aimed at Moscow, all around Russia. And we don't expect them to be a little upset with us. When we have our missiles pointed all at them, they don't have them near us. When they put them in Cuba, that was the worst thing in the world. But it's okay for us to put all of our weapons aimed at Russia and think that they're supposed to be not an enemy. Now, talking to the Russians as much as I do, they said, we love you guys. We love Americans. We love your government. Why do you hate us so much? You know, we would like to be your friend. One of the things that I've done for 25 years, aerial firefighting.
You know, we had bad fires on California. Thousands and thousands of, tens of thousands of homes being destroyed every year, millions of acres. Since 1995, Russia has, through me, has volunteered to bring the largest firefighting aircraft in the world over here to fight our fires. I fight fires all over the world using the Russian aircraft. We can put a fire out over 12 football fields in 10 seconds. Nothing in the world can compare with that. And they've tried to volunteer to bring that over here, saying we would like to be a partner, we'd like to be a friend, but you want to treat us as an enemy. We'd like to show you something that we have that you don't have, that we can save lives. And show up with the Russian flag on our plane, that people say, you know, those guys are not so bad. We can work with them. And yet the U.S. Forest Service and our government says, we're not going to allow any foreign competition. We're going to let the forest burn. We're going to let the animals burn up. We're going to let tens of thousands of people lose their homes because we don't want any foreign intervention from somebody that would make us look bad because they can do something better than we can. And I get a little furious about that, but I'll let that's enough.
Thanks. No, I know you're talking people to people here.
What motivates Mr. Putin? Germany sits in the middle of Europe, more or less. And on this side, or for you folks on that side, on this side of Germany, you got Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Latvia, you got the Ukraine, Crimea, and then you got Russia. It goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And on this side, you got France, Spain, Holland, Portugal, the Scandinavian countries, Great Britain, and so on. When Hitler decided he needed to rule the world, he went over to Stalin and signed a non-aggression pact. Because Hitler was smart enough to know, I don't want to be fighting on both sides at the same time. So with that secured, he went into Poland, took over Poland, performed the Anschluss with Austria, and then came after the rest of Europe. And he did very well. He drove all the way to the Channel, and Churchill made his speech and all this kind of thing. And then Hitler forgot his basics, and he attacked into Russia. And the Russians did what they always do. They backed up and backed up and backed up until the Russian winter started. In World War II, the Russians lost 25 million people dead.
Yeah.
We lost 400,000. 14% of the Russian population died in World War II. Out of 100 Russians, 14 died in World War II. The Germans had laid siege to the city of Leningrad. That siege held, I believe, 2 years. They were stacking up bodies on the streets for them to come around and pick up and put in mass graves. A man came home one day and saw his wife's shoes sticking out of that pile of bodies, and saw the feet moving. That was Mr. Putin's mother. He grew up, he was a little bitty kid in the siege of Leningrad. And where was I going? 14 out of 100 Russians died in World War II. The percentage of our population that died in World War II was 0.3%. 400,000. Now, as World War II progressed, you got Germany sitting here in the middle. We come this way, the Russians come that way, we meet in the middle, and we divide Europe. And all of us grew up during the Cold War with all these Russian satellites, Poland, Hungary, Estonia, Latvia, the Ukraine, the Crimea, and so on. 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Warsaw Pact, which was their version of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, also collapsed. And the Russian troops all went back home. And guess what? We immediately started recruiting Eastern European nations to join NATO. Now, Mr. Putin has said time and again the two greatest tragedies to strike Russia in the 20th century were World War II and the collapse of our empire. Now, is he trying to reestablish that empire? I don't think for a minute that he sees Russian troops going back into Poland and East Germany and that kind of thing. But There are many other ways to establish influence, and we saw some of those today. Economically, where does Western Europe's natural gas come from? It ain't Texas. And so that's what we're in. We're in this long-term struggle for influence. And, you know, down in Southeast Asia, the folks have, the Thai especially, have a lot of their colorful sayings. And one of them is, when the elephants fight, the grass gets trimmed. And we're one of the elephants. But that's what drives Mr. Putin, is those memories of World War II and then the loss of that empire.
One thing I learned about CMU's lifelong learning program was that Russia was the only country that didn't participate in the Renaissance or the Reformation. Everyone else already did. And when you think about how that changed the world and the thinking and all, and they never participated in it. They closed themselves off to it. So you can kind of understand a little bit better, you know, how they evolved.
Yeah, one thing to think about that in perspective is Russia has never had a democracy. They have always been ruled under some sort of authoritarian rule. They have never really had a true democracy. So that's, you know.
And I think that's what concerns me, you know, when I was talking about the Russian influence, is that out of this chaos that was created, I mean, exasperated, okay, with our disagreement over much more issues than even what we're talking about today, is that when democracy gets messy, you know, there are people who think then an autocratic government would make it so much easier. We wouldn't have to worry about this and this and this. And, you know, there's a lot of psychology in the fact that, you know, there are people in our country who have always been drawn to a strong autocratic type of government, even in this country.
Yeah. Winston Churchill has an old saying, at least a saying it's attributed to him: democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others.
Well, I have a question about from here forward. What is our government doing to fight this cyber warfare? And recently I just read an article that said that so many $1 million, 400 some $million, was allocated for this fight, and to date, zero has been spent. Now, is that misinformation? Who knows? Because, you know, you try to do what you can to keep up with things and you don't know. But do you, either of you, know if what is being done?
I've heard the same thing you've heard. It's Congress, came up with the money. It just hasn't been implemented.
Oh my gosh.
That's what I've heard.
Here in Virginia, we have done a number of things. Some of it has been paid for. Some has been paid for by our tax money. We have received some federal funds that we've used. Number one, certain types of voting machines have been decertified, which means us up in Northumberland County had to come up with $100,000 to buy a bunch of new machines, and other municipalities around the arc. So here in Virginia, we have decertified a number of voting machines and systems. We have instituted a number of ways to get into the state registration system. It used to be you went in with a password. You can't do that anymore. Now, the way that our registrars get into the system and anybody else changes every day. So the level of security has been heightened considerably. Is it absolutely hacker-proof? Probably not, because nothing is, but it is as good as we can get it right now, and tomorrow it's going to be better. I don't know what every other state has done. I know that the two companies whose software was hacked have been working very closely with the National Security Agency to make sure it doesn't happen again. One problem that you run into is you really don't want to talk about a lot of this stuff in public because you're giving away your secrets. And I know is any example, the other 50 states have done a good bit towards securing their voting systems, but I don't know if they have all done that. Georgia, for example, has turned around and bought some machines, and we had that thing headaches with people can't get their ballots and the ballots printed, and that kind of thing. So I would have to say it's probably looks better. But remember too, the problem was not so much hacking into the voting system as it was hacking into people's minds, spreading information.
And that was my question is, how do we fight that, Jay?
Well, that's what I was trying to say here. We gotta inform yourself, you gotta talk to your neighbors. If you are active on social media, which social media is the source of a lot of things that influence people, be certain that you are not influenced by falsehoods, and be certain that you don't try to influence other people by falsehoods. I know that's, again, not a very solid answer, but, democracy takes a lot of work.
Eric was saying that there are thousands of state employees, U.S. employees, who are working so hard, trying to follow the rules, putting in extra long hours. But our problem, I think, is not the people below, the top people who are making their own rules and not following the Constitution.
What does that mean to you?
Well, what that means, I think, okay? Joe and I and other civil servants and state, we're policy implementers. We don't make policy. Okay, it's just like General Cotton said in the video. The intelligence community doesn't make policy. All right, it's the elected officials who make the policy.
But the Constitution states what you're supposed to do.
But the Constitution is over
And some would think that some people are acting outside of the Constitution and violating their oath of office. Several people.
All right,
Against
I've read the
being
Constitution, I read it recently because I have been hearing a lot of things about what is and isn't constitutional. It's very ambiguous. There's a lot of wiggle room in there, and we've interpreted it in specific ways over the years, and that's fine. But people who think the Constitution is a guideline for all activity, I'm sorry, but go read it.
I made a decision early on in the current presidential campaign that every time something popped up in the news or on social media that was some negative research on one of the Democrats, I was going to assume that was generated by the IRA or somebody. So there's lots of stuff that's going back and forth, and you have no idea whether it's genuine opera research or if it's Russian-generated opera research. Anyway, so my question is, based on what you've seen or heard in the news in terms of the various opinions expressed about the candidates, who do you think Putin would like to get the Democratic nomination?
I was gonna say, remember he's intelligence.
Let's just see how it sorts out. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I want to hark back to the media and what you can rely on. Now, I have taken the Guardian Weekly for 50 years in various countries in the world. And I like the Guardian Weekly because it is owned by a trust. It isn't beholden to some big guy buying up the whole. You're all of them just about old enough to remember the Suez Crisis.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, the Guardian Weekly was about the only newspaper in England, in Britain, that came out against going into Suez against Nasser. And Americans didn't join that folly with the French. And they stuck to their guns, and it impacted them, but they came out of it. They were protected. And the other thing the Guardian Weekly does is it puts opinion on the top of an article, it's the sort of regular news
which in the old days was like what really happened, as far as they knew. Those are the things that I like. I agree, it's very hard. How are you going to armour the American public against this? And it's when truth is being undermined, you can't. I mean, you've got to make people really think about what they're doing. But you know, I look around this room, and most of the people are maybe a little bit older than me, but most of them, I'm one of the oldest in the room probably. You know, and we don't have one black face in the room. Very, very few really young people, and I appreciate that young gentleman over there.
Thank you for calling.
But you know, like, what a minority, and those are the things that worry me. How do we manage to armour people so that they can be comfortable that they've actually done the best they can at getting at it?
I would hope that what Joe and I are doing here today helps a little bit.
It does. I was going to say that. Thank you very much.
And I would say, you know, don't be afraid. You know, I don't know how it is here on the Middle Peninsula, but up in the Northern Neck, you know, everybody's very polite, and you don't want to say anything that's going to offend anybody, because particularly if you call somebody out, who you're talking to might be kin to that person, you know. So you know, but we need to speak out. You need to speak out. And mind you, one thing Thomas Jefferson said about electorate, you know, democracy cannot flourish without an informed electorate. And that's tough now.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Mr. Murray.
Last comment, and I'll get out of the way here. I know it's very fashionable to talk about Russia being an enemy. And again, they've been tough many years, but they've always been an ally. They've never been an enemy professionally. They may stir up trouble, but they're so much more like us than most any other country in the world, or people. But if Russia is an enemy, why would we give our enemy billions of dollars a year to get us into space and share our space technology with them? Because that technology is better than ours. We go to space on Russian engines in Russia. We're going to space, Wallops Island, and places like this, on Russian, Ukrainian, Kazakh engines here in the United States. If Russia hated us so much, why did they share their military technology for ejection seats? All of our fighter aircraft now use Russian ejection seats because they save pilots' lives. At lower altitudes, they can go out. If they want to get rid of Americans, they wouldn't have shared that with us. Always ask questions.
Yeah, well, why didn't they accept American help to rescue those submariners when that submarine?
National pride, and we have the same thing over here. It's no different. It's all national pride.
Russians are very proud people.
Very proud. Great job, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Not that it's going to probably sway anybody here, but you could spread the word. Unfun fact, Fox News is not licensed as media news. It is licensed as entertainment.
Wow.
That is why they can say the things that they say and get away with it, but with the FCC, because they are not licensed as news.
Is there any innocent explanation why our president would have a meeting with Putin without no takers or?
Oh, one can speculate. You know, being Joe and I, by the way, by some accounts, are members of the deep state. So we've been talking to the deep state. But in my deep state mentality, I can think of why Mr. Trump did that.
I said innocent.
Innocent.
Innocent explanations.
Okay. You ever heard the term useful idiot?
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Trump, my opinion, but it's based on some experience. If Mr. Trump is not a controlled asset of Mr. Putin, he's certainly one of the best useful idiots there has been. Anyway, it's about time to wrap up.
We really appreciate Dennis, Joe, we appreciate y'all work effort and everything you presented. It's been very interesting. We have a little takeaway for us.